Yo guys, what is up? Max on our Borderlands 4 video, and today we're going over our updated Storm Bringer Ordnance Amon build. Now, Ordnance is one of Amon's, in my opinion, strongest build playstyle. However, in the patch that happened yesterday, they actually buffed one of his Ordnance skills, which allows him to squeak out a ton more damage on an Ordnance build. I'll bring down everything you guys need to know. We're going to cue the little intro montage now. So in the patch notes yesterday, there was a note about Primal Surge. Primal Surge passive now properly restores shield and ammo. Now, I had been using this skill in the prior Amon build, and I didn't notice anything weird or wrong about it, but when I went back to actually watch my gameplay... So if you look at the old Amon build guide, there's actually a moment like 30 seconds in. I wanted to see what was working or not working with Primal Surge, and you can clearly see that I'm shooting Bottled Lightning a ton at the at Radix, and my shield is just not going up. All of those ticks of the Bottled Lightning should have been regenning my shield, and I didn't notice it, and they're not. My shield is not going up. I was still getting overshield from a separate Ordnance skill. However, I was not getting any shield restoration from Primal Surge. And this is going to allow us to do something really cool on Ordnance Amon. You can probably see where this is going. We can use amp shields on an Ordnance build, which I didn't really even consider beforehand. But with an amp shield, we're getting a ton of extra damage on our Ordnance shots. Now, note that with Primal Surge, like having a restoration of your shield on hit, that doesn't work as well for like every weapon. Like if you're shooting a Gatling gun, you're not going to be amping every shot. But if you're shooting like a slow rocket launcher or the Bottled Lightning, you can basically amp every other shot, which is a huge buff for mobbing, but it also works really well for bossing. And Amon also gets like 1.5x of any gun damage buffs. So if we're using a shield that gives us a bunch of gun damage, that gun damage applies to his Ordnance, but it also gives 1.5 of that value because Full Spectrum Arsenal allows us to benefit from an additional 50% of our gun damage. So basically what this allows us to do now on Amon is take, in my opinion, pretty much his strongest build and make it even stronger and basically one-tap bosses. So now that we've done kind of a brief overview, let's get into the specifics. Also, a huge thank you to one of my viewers, Elden Bling, who helped me min-max this and put a lot of this build together with me. So huge shout out to them. But we're going to be using a few things. So for like, mostly for mobbing, you can use Crucible. Anytime you throw a Crucible axe, you'll get Ordnance cooldown back. So if your Ordnance does ever go on cooldown, we rock Crucible. However, for bossing, we can get extra damage from Cryonic Thrum, which is very, very nice. And that also gives us Firewall, which anytime that we shoot through Firewall, we get increased projectile damage, which is quite nice. Just a little bit of extra juice. In our skill tree, we're going to be going for Scorched Kairos, more Ordnance damage and more mag size. This mag size lets us get more mag size into our Ordnance so that we can fire more times. I am changing the points on the old build. We were using Bullet Hail. This gave us a ricochet chance for cryo damage. I did this and I said it was suboptimal. I just thought it was cool to see these ricochets. However, to squeak out the most boss damage, we are going to be putting points into Battleborn. This is 30% gun damage when our health is full, which is basically all the time. But once again, we get 1.5x of this, so it's like 45% Ordnance damage, which is pretty freaking massive. Then we go down to Icy Rage. This is more stacking gun damage whenever we're killing an enemy with cryo damage or status effects, which we do a lot of status effect damage on this build. We're putting 5 points into Primal Surge. Probably not totally necessary to put 5 points here. However, it just feels good to make sure that we're getting all the shield restoration and ammo restoration, so we're not running out of Ordnance. We're putting 1 point into Blackout. You can actually put more points here. The damage of Blackout is currently bugged, still bugged. That might get fixed in the upcoming patch. However, 5 points versus 0 points or 1 point is the exact same amount of damage. Credit to EpicNNG, who I believe discovered that. Crit chance is still nice to guarantee proc those status effects, but we're kind of tight on points already. And then for our red tree, we've got 3 points into impetus, mainly for the movement speed, 2 into heavy plate, wield the storm, status effect damage and duration. Status effects are very, very important for this build, as we'll explain once we get to like gear and stuff like that. 1 point into gut punch so that we have a chance to make enemies take 20% increased damage. Does a little bit more than the extra 5th point into bullet storm, which gives us more gun damage. And then we go to Berserk for 30% bonus cryo damage whenever activate our Forge skill, which there's only red, which gives us stacking more bonus cryo damage and keeps our Berserk up. This isn't like the most important thing for bossing. You can do the bosses without this. However, for mobbing, it's just a disgusting amount of extra damage. And if we're not using cryo weapons, we just get a whole bunch of extra cryo damage. Well, even if you are using cryo damage, it's just very nice to have. All right, now let's talk gear and ordnance. So for weapons to hold with this build, we're using ordnance most of the time. So we're mainly using weapons to either get out of Fight for Our Life if we go into Fight for Our Life, or just to like buff up our weapons. On the Origo kill, for example, I was using a Buri with a taser, not to actually do damage to Origo, but one of the things that we are benefiting from pretty massively is like things that stack up damage. For example, we do this whenever we deal gun damage. This gives like a 75% ordnance buff when it's fully stacked. So it's a huge thing that you're missing out on if you're like doing bossing and not having this. So for example, sometimes on bosses, I will like shoot down a taser at the boss to try to get that to stack up before I get to fire my ordnance. The same goes for Tedior turrets. Tedior turrets can benefit from like ordnance stuff apparently, but they also can deal gun damage and proc some of your like skills based off of stacking. So for example, you can get them to start proccing bullet storm, applying status effects to get your gun damage going before you start firing those rocket launchers off. So that's really what we're using for like weapons, tasers, turret, Tediors, and also I like to keep like a spread launcher on me just in case I go down to one-shot a mob to get back up. For bossing on a Repkit, we're going to be using something like Elemental Affinity plus Amp. You could also use Splash Damage plus Amp, but there's a lot of ways to boss on this build. There's a lot of different options for like particularly like boss one-shots now. Amp does increase the damage of your next ordnance shot by 200%, which is pretty gross. You compare that with like Elemental Affinity or Splash Damage to super juice the damage of your shot. The reason we're doing all this damage to buff up like a single shot isn't so much to make a rocket hit super hard, because the rocket will hit super hard, but all of those buffs seem to affect Tail of the Comet. So if we're hitting really hard with a bunch of rockets, all of a sudden we get dots that are just going to tick the rest of the boss's health away. It is pretty nuts. For ordnance, there's a ton of options. This build is set up to like literally you pick any ordnance off the ground and you can use it. I've got a ton of ordnance in my inventory. For the like particular boss one shots, we were using a purple Torg with shrapnel and triple barrel. Triple barrel is really nice because it allows you to get like one big shot off of a ton of rockets that do a ton of damage, and the shrapnel modifier means that they're going to explode, and all those other explosions can also proc additional dots. Note that when you're charging up and firing a rocket, that only the first rocket out of the barrel seems to get the amp from both your shield and your Repkit. However, it does seem that that's like enough to one-shot most bosses in the game. I did mess around with some single fire rockets to try to amp every shot, and it just felt a little bit slower. Like I was using this like shrapnel airburst, so all the shrapnel breaks basically on the boss. Really good, but not quite as good for at least boss one shots as the like triple barrel modifier, so that all of these rockets are coming out at once and all of them can proc these huge dots. So that was what we were mainly using for bossing. However, for like mobbing or literally just anything else, even on bossing, there's a ton of really powerful weapons. The streamer is really good on this build. You just spam out stationary beams. The disc jockey is really fun. It's great for mobbing. It can do bossing as well. Obviously, we use a lot of the bottled lightning. Bottled lightning is, in my opinion, still like one of the best for mobbing. You just spray this thing out and it'll like now with all of the damage, and because this thing fires slowly, like you're basically guaranteeing 150% amp on every shot of the bottled lightning, which is crazy. And then like Gatling guns, I usually go for like something with like explosive rounds, and then double barrels, or the Atling gun is also really fun. Note that I did mess around with MERV ordnances. These with the high caliber modifier, if you have MERV plus high caliber, will spawn additional MERVs. So like the high caliber makes your bullet penetrate, so it'll spawn MERVs on hit and then spawn MERVs on the like detonation again. If you get that with like homing, for example, you can do some pretty ridiculous damage. This was found by CZ47 and EpicNNG. I have a credit down below in the description. But if you go for high caliber on this build, you could also use some like crazy MERV ordnance that does a ton of damage. I personally ended up preferring using the like big shrapnel rockets, but that's also a really cool option. For our class mod, there's 2 class mod options now. I was originally just super stuck on the Cyborg, and the Cyborg is quite nice for this build. It gives you basically points into all of the things that you care about. There is some really nice Grenadier class mods. I don't have a perfect one here, but Grenadier is not something to sleep on, mainly because it can roll extra points into Blackout for extra crit chance, but it can also roll points into Wild Heart, which gives us more status effect damage, which is something we very much deeply care about. I do think that the Cyborg is better, but if you find like a good Grenadier, it's not like something to just throw away. It can actually give you some better boss DPS than a Cyborg. For our shield, we're using the Watts for Dinner. Now, this gives you a bunch of damage. It gives you bonus shock damage and a bunch of extra bonus gun damage. This is a lucky roll. It's not guaranteed to roll amp on a Watts for Dinner, but it also doesn't need to be a Watts for Dinner. If you are like feeling uncomfortable or want like a more comfy playstyle, the Super Soldier still works great on this build. Still going to give you more fire rate, more movement speed, and ammo regen, so you can spam your ordnance even more. I don't think it's necessarily needed now because we're getting just so much ammo back, and this is going to give us so much more damage, so we have to shoot less. However, the Super Soldier is still a great option, but for most of the gameplay, I was using the Watts for Dinner. And then lastly, for your enhancement doesn't really matter what manufacturer it's for. You do want to try to find gun damage and gun splash damage. Those are the 2 that do seem to affect ordnance on your enhancement. I actually am not totally sure if gun fire rate works or not. I haven't tested that, but gun damage and gun splash damage seem to work. And so getting an enhancement with those is fantastic. Now, for your firmware, the best setup for most firmware, in my opinion, is using Gadget Ahoy, which gives you ordnance cooldown, ordnance damage, and 20% ordnance damage on kill, which is really nice. Plus 2 airstrike for more splash damage and splash radius. If you are specifically wanting to use Malawan MERV launchers, which also do a ton of damage, you do need high caliber to like get them to really keep up. So you'd go 3 high caliber, and then in my opinion, you'd probably do airstrike, 2 airstrike for the radius and extra splash damage. For your specializations, I don't have the total amount of points that I'd like. It'd be really great to get the best defense for another 30% all damage dealt on this build, but with limited points, I put points into Tripwire, Full Spectrum Arsenal, Fragmentation Payload, and Riddle You This. This massively gives us more damage with our ordnance, and all of that damage is going to benefit from Riddle You This, which is really, really nice. If we were just focusing on bossing and had enough points, I would take out the point into Tripwire and put it into the best defense. However, if your ordnance does ever go down, this is pretty nice just to get a bunch of cooldown back, especially if you're throwing the axes. I'm going to do a quick like boss rotation because there are like a few things going on. So I usually like to start with the shield, and then I'll put my shield on or activate our action skill, then do some tasers. The tasers will like help stack up some of our damage, and then amp Repkit, swap to our launcher, load it up, and then you want to aim for the crit. Ideally is where you're like trying to hit on the boss. We don't have a crit knife. You do more damage if your rocket launcher crits, which we have a chance to crit with the blackout skill. However, you still do more damage if your rockets hit headshots or if they hit weak points on enemies. But that's kind of like the rotation. And then if you don't one-shot them, as you can see, our dots are dealing like hundreds of thousands of damage a second. And that is kind of the boss rotation. Guys, that is going to do it for the build guide. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know what build you'd like to see next, and I will catch y'all in the next one. Take care. Peace.